NWA Power and AEW Dark. I have not seen AEW Dark. Do you want to share some of your thoughts on the first episode and utilizing the matches they taped last week?
I was honestly surprised that it was as substantial of a show as it was. It was a full hour of pretty much like end-to-end wrestling with links shot with Tony Schiavone from like their virtual set that they use for Road to. Just introducing all the matches and teeing up, the episode of Dynamite that was to come the next day. Very much like, full matches, uninterrupted with commercials, obviously, because it's YouTube, and it was a space where you got to see, a lot of the talent that wasn't utilized on the body of the TV show. I would say like the matches were all very good, with the exception of the women's match, which I didn't really personally get into. But everything else was like really solid. I will say, watching it after NWA Power though, I felt like it was almost, too much of the same of what I've already seen. I didn't necessarily need it. However, next week, of course, will be very different, especially if there's a Kenny Omega Joey Janela match. But, certainly by that point, I wasn't craving for more. But NWA Power, which John and I think you and I should talk about right now, to me was like such a breath of fresh air. Actually, such a breath of old air that hasn't been breathed for such a long time that it felt fresh. That to me, like, firmly established the NWA as having a place in the wrestling landscape because it was completely different.
So you and I talked about this last week, and the tapings took place a week ago, Monday and Tuesday. And the first night, there was photos from those inside the arena, and you got to see the set design. And if you saw those photos, you were hooked. I think you were buying into, I might not become a regular viewer, but I want to at least check this out to see what it is. I think it was the best commercial they could have asked for, was those set photos getting out. I think it was a guy by the name of Ben Turpin who tweeted it out. And when you saw this set, I think like that was the door opening. And to see on Tuesday night, like I was curious to watch this, and to see, we talk about all the hours of wrestling content and just trying to be able to get people's attention, to see what the NWA did on Tuesday night, where for one night they were able to cut through all of the clutter on nights when you did have other stuff that you could watch if you so chose. Like Impact was airing their pay-per-view on Access. AEW Dark was there. And, and you had other options for sure. And it just seemed like on my timeline, everyone was just gushing about this show.
Reddit
it was,
as well.
It was all like, we're talking here on a Wednesday night, and on YouTube alone, this thing has 215,000 views. Now, of course, that's, people that click on it, how long they watched it. But this first episode, it could not have been a bigger hit than what it was, and was above what I expected it to be coming out of the gate. Like this definitely, The Rock tweeted about this today.
Wow. More importantly, I think it'll be a show that'll continue to attract more people because through word of mouth. And let's perhaps get into maybe some of the nuts and bolts of why you and I might have liked this show so much. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right, John, the set, but it's just like the ethos of like what they're trying to set up. And I really do have to give credit to like the 10 Pounds of Gold series that David Lagana and Lightning One have been producing thus far, which with like, they released one right before this episode trying to, tell you like some behind the scenes of like what it was like to shoot this. But more importantly, you saw like a pre-production interview with Billy Corgan talking to the talent of what he was looking for. And he talked about something about wanted to set the stage for people, for the talent, because he thinks talented people should be whatever. He made an analogy to like writing an album and leaving space for a guitarist to write a solo, and he doesn't have to like tell the guitarist, hey, write me a great solo. He knows the guitarist is going to do a great solo himself because that's what they're trained to do. And he has that same philosophy with wrestlers. He's going to craft out this show, him along with David Lagana and all the other people involved. They're going to craft this show and leave these empty spaces for very talented people to have their wrestling matches, to cut their promos. And that's what the show felt like. It felt like wrestlers being wrestlers in a very bare bones, very nostalgic setting as well. But I think what feels so great about that nostalgia is that this is a place where wrestlers have minimal production and they are talented, and you trust them to be talented in front of a live TV or at least a tape TV audience.
And I think it was also getting several personalities across in this format so that it's not just leaning on the nostalgia, because ultimately I don't think you can do that long term where the only appeal is the fact that it's dressed up as an old studio wrestling show. But the positive of that is, like, the NWA, they cannot do a giant budget production. So if you have to go smaller budget, make that your calling card. Yes. I'm not watching this feeling like I'm watching something where it's 100 people in this small studio. It doesn't feel low rent at all. It felt like professionally done. You had some great talkers on this, and just the principle of the show was, we have a main event, and we're going to constantly remind you of this main event throughout the show, add to the story, and at the end of it, there is the question: will this be Tim Storm's last opportunity at the NWA Championship? And by the end of the night, you got an answer to that question, and it was just very refreshing to hear. And you had, I think, a lot of the right guys in terms of Nick Aldis, who was phenomenal as your champion, playing that role on this show. You had Eli Drake, who is a very underrated talker, and I think not enough focus was placed on him in Impact. James Storm was in there. Then you had the total contrast in Eddie Kingston, who, for the brief time he was on, he was great in this format.
I think one of the calling cards that we've seen, aside from the concept of like the nostalgia and the stage, is the fact that they are getting to feature the best talkers in the industry, or at least people who can talk incredibly well that aren't being featured and aren't being allowed to, given the space to talk the way they do here on this show. And I'm excited all of a sudden for Eli Drake now. All of a sudden, I'm excited for James Storm. You look at this roster, like on paper, it does not look all that interesting at all, to be quite honest with you. But
they're not going in the direction of like, hey, we're not going out there to try and do blow away matches, but we're going to hopefully have stories where you care about and that's a question. Like, today's audience, like, they want that high quality wrestling, and they're doing something different. And I would argue that maybe you have to try something different versus trying to be one of so many others, that you can't compete at that level with so many others that have the endless talent rosters and production behind it. Like, I don't know if you can be competitive going that direction. No,
you can't. And I think, again, that's what is so brilliant about like them doubling down on the history and the nostalgia front of it, because wrestling, at least, what I know of wrestling from this particular era that they're trying to replicate, is that it is very much talk, maybe personality first, promo first, and in-ring has to be at a certain level, but not necessarily the be-all, end-all. So I'm not expecting Canadian destroyers. I'm not expecting, triple moonsaults to come from this particular show. You might still get them, but to me, they're added bonuses. What I am expecting are 5-star promos. People that can improvise and deliver like great pro wrestling trash talk. And they managed to find a great cast thus far. And I'm really impressed that like even somebody like Eddie Kingston, you wouldn't necessarily associate with this style of like wrestling, really shines in a show like this. So great choice of cast members, great execution in this first episode, and I'm really excited to see like what other talent that's out there that isn't necessarily being like sought after by all these other companies. What can they do in this type of setting, in this playground?
Yeah. I thought the commentary team of Joe Galley and Jim Cornette, they've been great on those past NWA pay-per-views. I thought that great voices to kind of convey this. One of my favorite scenes on this was when Eddie Kingston is confronting the Dawsons, and we're right at like the studio interview setup, like you remember from Jim Crockett Promotions, and it's David Marquez who's the interviewer. And then earlier in the night, you had James Storm and Josephus brawling, and the camera just pans over as it's just this out of control scene. Like we go from one brawl to the next. And I think they got like the unpredictable chaos across in that one pan.
It looked exactly, I mean, like they really kind of like nailed the look of it. Like my kind of like familiarity with this style of wrestling was from cutting a lot of wrestling at the Chase when I was working at the Fight Network, and this exactly had that type of feel, down to like just the camera angles, the height of the camera. It's interesting, like, you know, talking about the production of this. This is what's so fascinating to me, is that like you mentioned, John, like they can't compete with the big stages of AEW or WWE. They can't compete with the camera work of or just like the budget of fireworks, pyro, all that shit. But they don't need to, because they're on a completely different path. And it's almost like, because they're trying to replicate what wrestling was like at that time, the shittier it looks, the more authentic it almost feels, you know? So I think it's fucking brilliant, and to me it really worked.
Yeah, like NWA, like they're in the same boat that MLW is in, where we're trying to do something totally different in the hopes that there is that television outlet or streaming platform that wants wrestling and are looking at some alternative. And that to me is what those companies are competing for, to ultimately land one of those big deals. And I would say that if you are just assessing from the outside and you're banking on like what promotion is going to make it, and you include ROH and Impact and NWA and MLW, it's like I look at all of them are doing different things, but I think that the NWA, they're trying to just do things on a pretty low scale, and I think just alone the visual, it's just such a stark contrast.
Yeah.
And you see MLW, they're trying to do a lot of different things within the body of their show. And interestingly enough, both of them, like 60 minutes, that's what they're keeping their shows to.
It's manageable. I mean, you're at a point now where you're trying to be either number 3 or number 4, and wrestling fans don't really have a lot of time to give anymore. So an hour is good. I think it's almost, you know, perfect. Until you see more demand, there's no need to put more effort into that production. But yeah, really impressed with the first effort. Now, will you, John, because I noticed in your report, you did not go with the 3 R's.
I'm not. Power. I'm not spelling this power.
I think that's a mistake. I don't think that's necessary, especially seeing the hashtag, you know, power. It's a little too cute.
I'm reading this article on The Wrap, which is a pretty well-known entertainment outlet. They went with, it's in quotations, power. But yeah. Here are some stats from that Wrap article. This is from Tony Maglio, who's been on our show. Of the more than, this was written on like Tuesday afternoon, or is today Tuesday? Today's Wednesday afternoon. Of the more than 2 million minutes watched, and first of all, the Wrap is covering the NWA. 22.1% of those came from suggested viewing from those watching AEW Dark.
Wow.
So people watching that, I guess it was like other suggestions, and sent people over to NWA Power.
Yeah.
Like this thing really hit on Tuesday night, far more than I thought it would.
And probably probably not intentional at all, because they announced their time before AEW Dark did, right?
Yeah. And we knew this was coming before.
It worked the other way too, because like in my like top suggestion is AEW Dark watching, but obviously, you know, NWA is getting a bit more from AEW, I would imagine. But you know, I think again it goes to show like what is required. And you know, people always ask us, John, like, oh, we're starting our podcast, like, do you have any advice? And often our advice is to find something different, like find your niche. And I'm just judging by my own interest in wrestling this year. What has been the things that I've been most excited about? DDT's Pool Wrestling, GCW Bloodsport, GCW Spring Break, and now NWA, like whatever they're doing here. And every one of those things is unique. Everything else, to me, is so much feels like an attempt to try to replicate either NXT or WWE, and I feel like we already have a pretty good version of that in AEW, and I don't really have much more room in my life for, another promotion that's trying to copy it. What I do have time for is something that feels completely different, and I'm really happy that I found something else.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what the tune-in numbers are like next week. Like if they came out and created way more momentum. That like this, you could only categorize this as a home run. I haven't seen anything negative about this for those that checked into it. So this was, you hate to call it like an unforeseen hit, but I could not have predicted this.
Me neither.
For the NWA to come out like this and be able to present something that hit such an audience like this did on Tuesday. And they're kind of like this little engine that could, and they certainly did on Tuesday night. And that segues in well because we are going to be joined this weekend by David Lagana, the vice president of the NWA. So we're going to chat all about episode 1 and looking ahead to episode 2 and all of the response to this as well. So that will be dropping on Sunday up at postwrestling.com and will be free for everybody to check out. So we encourage you to do that.